My name is Rich Casazza. I'm the Chief Special Procedures Technologist at Maimonides Medical Center in Brooklyn, New York. Also part of the CCI Journal social media team. And today I'm speaking with Carmelo Panetta from St. John's Medical Center in Maplewood, Minnesota. How you doing, Carmelo?
I'm doing great. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
No, happy to have you. Happy to have you. Today we're going to be discussing, Carmelo was the primary investigator on what I thought was a great study, especially with radiation. It's one of the most adverse occupational hazards interventional cardiologists face today. And the study was reduced radiation exposure in the cardiac catheterization laboratory with a novel vertical radiation shield. So just to get a little background, Carmelo, how do you guys, account for radiation on a daily basis?
Yeah, it became that's a great question. So there is dosimeters that we wear that are checked used to be on a weekly basis, and they bumped it up to a monthly basis. When they when they changed our hospital system and they downsized, they closed this one hospital and they wanted to push us out to another hospital and build that up, they temporarily put in a mobile lab, and radiation exposures were actually much higher. So I took advantage of this and used a separate dosimeter, the same one actually I used for the study, and also recorded radiation levels. So I did that in addition to what they were recording. Plus we do have the milligray, that's the cath machine itself, the cath x-ray tube.
Sure.
And also tells us, just to give us an idea as to what we're working with.
And what's your typical lab setup, just on a case by case basis, to protect you from radiation?
So there's obviously the lead shields that we all wear. We have a hanging or ceiling mounted lead shield. We have the drapes along the side of the cath lab table, and they've since put in really nice new cath labs that have lower radiation with their updated computer software. And then in addition, we use the horizontal radiation pads. And in addition to on select patients where it's going to be high radiation, I would add the Steradian shield, or the vertical, get a little vertical protection. It's that gap between the lead shield and the patient, the ceiling mounted shield, is really what accounts for a lot of extra radiation.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. So tell me a little bit about the VRS, the vertical radiation shield. So, how did it come to be? How was it developed? I mean,
Sure.
what's the genesis of that?
Well, I'm not the one who developed it. It was a radiologist, interventional radiologist named Greg Gordon with Radix Devices, who developed the first generation Steradian shield. And they just actually came out with a second generation Steradian shield that's it's just hit the market. So I'm not going to be breaking any issues.
Sure, of course.
It's basically, it's a horizontal radiation pad, like a rad pad, but it has structure to it, so you can bend it up and it'll hold vertical protection. So it provides both vertical and horizontal protection. And the data actually looks really promising. They did in a bench top with a cath lab with a Phantom. It looks great, and a lot easier to work with than the original Steradian shield or vertical protection shield. So I'm excited. That's going to be coming out soon. We're putting that data together for an abstract that should be going out in the next week or two. So I think most importantly, I think it's going to really help lower radiation exposure for the operators out there.
Yeah, it's incredibly important. So if we really, when I read this study, I mean, I really love how you design this. I mean, you really take into account so many things. When I look at my notes here, you know, to start off, you established the spider view, the LEO caudal, yields 2 to 4 times the amount of radiation for the operator. And, you know, that's really important. It's such an important view, especially for left mainstem bifurcation, osteal LEDs, osteal circs. You accounted for SID, which is, for everybody out there, source to image distance, which again is extremely important. We always want to keep our II as close to the patient as possible. I don't know if I'm allowed to use II anymore. I used it once and they told me it was a flat panel now. It's not an II anymore, it's a flat panel.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep,
I'm from your same generation.
I
I have to correct
can't get
myself
rid
and
of
call
it.
it a detector.
Yeah. Yeah, and the other thing I found really, really important, which may not be as important with the newer machines, but you know, when your magnification field went from 10 to 8,
Yeah,
it almost doubles the amount of exposure. And you know, in interventional cardiology, we're constantly using, you know, magnification to really delineate lesions and kind of open things up. Another thing that you did,
yep. Both of those are really key points.
yeah, yeah, that's why, you know, again, that's why this study was really important. You also established that the distance from your access site provided a 30% reduction at 40 centimeters and 47% at 120 centimeters. So you really kind of brought, you know, something from my past, the inverse square law, into play. So, you know, when you put all these things together, you really accounted for the main tenets of radiation, which is time, distance, and obviously your shielding. So, I mean, that was great. So, I mean,
Thank you.
how did you, you know, kind of, I mean, was that, you know, the thought process behind this?
Well, I think I had it as an interventionist. There are a lot of unanswered questions I had. I heard in a couple of prior papers where they talked about AP cranial views, straight lateral views as being concerning, and so we tested that in the cath lab using the anthropomorphic phantom, and that really was, I think, for me, helpul to be able to say, hey, you know what, we got to be more careful. Now, obviously, every person's different, and it was a phantom. It wasn't a person. But I do take notice. You can argue both AP cranial or steep cranial views, steep caudal views, especially with some REO or LEO. You're going to get more radiation, and you got to take more precautions with it. And just standing back, and I got into the habit of getting the position. And if I'm going to do Cine, I'll take a step to the right to get my distance from the patient, just to help lower it, because it's not, you know, yes, it's that one-time exposure that can cause a localized injury, but it's repeated exposures at the lower levels that puts you at risk for cancer. So that's kind of where I'm much more particular and anxious about.
Yeah, I bet you it's a lot easier with a left radial approach with dedicated catheters too.
It does, yeah.
The catheter's not moving.
Yep. That's why I fell more in line with the left radial over the right radial, because the catheters went in a lot easier. And that seems to be some of the data showing that, you know, it's not overwhelming. And if you get an operator who's really savvy with right radial, then it's probably a wash. But I got to tell you, it's just so much easier. I'm not fighting the catheters. I'm not fighting the arches, any of that stuff when I go left radial. And that essentially that corresponds to having less radiation. So if you're not going to be fighting things, you're not going to have to fluoro as much. You're not going to have to run extra wires up. All these other tricks that we all learned, but it does add more fluoro time and more radiation exposure.
Yeah, you're preaching to the choir on that one. So if we do take a look at these phantoms, the first one so you actually used a rad pad and the VRS.
Yes.
And there
Yes.
was no change in the tube output, and you actually found an 80% reduction in, I think that was in your first cath lab. I'm assuming that was an older
Yep.
cath lab.
Yes. Yeah. 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 That was one from 2000. I want to say it was 2006, 2008, maybe, that cath lab. So that was an older model that was generating a lot more radiation. And I thought that was a good one to use in the clinical portion of the study. But we used both, actually, and we collected data from old cath labs as well as a newer cath lab that was placed in 2000, I think it was 2016, for this paper.
Yeah,
And
yeah, I noticed that. I assumed that because in the second with the Phantom B, I thought it was the second room. You had 100% radiation reduction with that Phantom and the VRS and RadPad.
yeah, yeah. That was when we did it with the Phantom. We did it in two locations. We did one with the Toshiba lab at the University of Minnesota, and the other one there at St. Joe's in the older lab, to really see, this is okay. We're going to do this. Let's test it in the worst case scenario and see if we're going to see a benefit. And it was so profound that then when we opened it up to the clinical side, we opened it up to all the cath labs.
Yeah, that
And
that really, it really rung a bell with me when I saw that, and I was really impressed with that. I mean, you really kind of put yourself, or put the Phantom, I should say, and your dosimeter in the worst position.
yeah,
And despite that, you still have these significant reductions.
yep. And as an aside, I also I wore a dosimeter one time when I needed to get a CAT scan on myself, and yeah, a CT CAT scan of my chest, abdomen, and pelvis. That radiation exposure, and this has never been published, but that radiation exposure was equivalent to one of my partners who did an hour-long case on a patient in an older cath lab with a BMI, I think it was around 45. So, these patients are out there, and
Oh yeah.
these operators are getting a CAT scan, chest, abdomen, and pelvis when they're getting exposed to these when they're getting exposed to these patients who are and in older cath labs as well. So more is better. More protection is always better, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see it on social media all the time. People put shields in the wrong spot, and you
Yep.
know, I get it. I like to refer to it as shield migration, because you get into these tough procedures, you're really not paying attention to where the shield is, and it kind of migrates, during the procedural dynamics, and you really open yourself up to this, scatter radiation, where I feel like, when you have, a rad pad or something as innovative as the VRS, you kind of can focus on what you're doing with your coronaries, as opposed to having that in the back of your head where you're
Yep.
getting this, excessive exposure that's, really not necessary.
Yep. Yep. Exactly. Exactly. And I think that's a wonderful point you made. And you can't emphasize enough to make sure your detector is down on the patient. Make sure your distance to the table height is as high as you can get it. Make sure your ceiling mounted shield is close down towards the patient. That's something that federally from Mayo pointed out. Really got to get that ceiling mounted shield pushed down on the patient as much as possible. And then you combine that with good shields on the side. You're wearing up-to-date lead shields and having them tested for yourself, as well as the horizontal radiation pads and the vertical radiation pads. I think you're doing about as much as you can do in that scenario. I'm sure they're going to come up with some better ideas, better mousetraps in the future. I'm looking forward to it. But for now, this is something that's in the market and it's on the table, and people should really take advantage of it.
So, when I take a look at this, so you actually enrolled 184 patients, and using both shields, the VRS and a RadPad, you found a 42% reduction, which is great. So I was just curious, which patients actually got the VRS, who didn't, and was it randomized in some fashion, or was it just
No, no, it wasn't randomized. We basically, they, we started just saying, I said, let's just track your radiation with what you have going now, and started tracking for, I think, 2 or 3 months worth. And then I said, okay, let's add in the Iridian Shield. And 1, 2, 3, there's four of my partner, myself and three other partners all did it. And we're using the Iridian Shield and track the radiation from that point forward. So it was not randomized. And that's why we actually showed the data on the patient profiles. Were the patients in the Iridian Shield group or the vertical shield group, were they a higher BMI? Were they longer cases? Were there more PCIs? Were there more grafts? And I believe actually was, frankly, it was actually a fewer graft cases or fewer PCIs, if I recall, in the vertical shield arm. So it was I liked it. I think it kind of showed that even in the setting of not a purely randomized fashion, but a group of patients where they're probably a slightly higher risk, you still got less radiation when adding the vertical shield protection.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, I mean, in your current practice, are you using this? Are you using a VRS often? Not at all. How are you guys doing it today?
Well, I got to tell you, in a modern lab where I have up-to-date software, I feel more comfortable. If it's a skinny person, I can bring the ceiling mounted shield right down on the patient. Yeah, no, I don't add one on. The old vertical shield. But if I have someone who's large, I can't bring the shield down, there's going to be a long case, then I would add in the vertical shield to it. But now with this new generation of vertical shields, it has both vertical and horizontal shield. It's just so much easier. I'm hoping we can get that in to the program, and then it's going to be a no-brainer. You just put that on the table. You can have it horizontal or flat, and then then it's just going to be, you'll just be using it with everyone. And already it's picking up, even without published data. There are centers around the U.S. that are already buying it and using it. We just got a word I heard last week that UCSF really likes it in one of their centers. So I'm really excited about it. I think it's going to be another game changer. It's going to help people out.
No, that's great. Is there any downside? I mean, do you ever feel like it kind of gets in the way with your vertical shield? I mean, did you notice any of that?
The first generation was a little clunky, I got to be honest with you. But the second generation, this new one that's come out, it's really nice. It's just slick. It has these bars on it. So when you tilt it, you could just fold it up and it'll stay in that position and block the gap. We joked about it, mind the gap over in England. They talk about that on the tube system. And it's the same idea. You just got to mind the gap. And when you have this new generation shielding place, you can just easily flip it up and it'll hold place. It'll be pretty simple.
Yeah. I mean, because I'm looking at it. I actually just shared the screen with you, the VRS. You can kind of see it right here, and it really fills that gap between the shield and the patient. I wonder if a study. So in my lab, we actually have a lead skirt retrofitted onto our shield.
Yes. Yeah, on the ceiling mounted shield. Yep.
Right. So it almost acts like a barrier in and of itself. But I think it would be interesting to compare the VRS to a ceiling mounted shield with that retrofitted skirt onto it. I mean, even at the very least, both of those in conjunction would probably yield a really significant advantage for the operator, especially with those really tough cases, especially now with all the structural interventions and the explosion of CTOs. These are things that we should really be paying attention to.
I agree. And the EP studies that are going on, and orthopedists out there, and the vascular surgeons are in the lab, let alone the interventional radiologists out there doing procedures. I think there's almost an explosion of more percutaneous procedures out there.
Yeah, the vascular surgeons and the CT surgeons want in now too, I hear.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
There's there's always a little bit of a turf war for procedures now, especially all these endovascular procedures.
It is, but the good news is that at least I'm really happy at our program. There is more camaraderie as we work together through these structural cases. And that's kind of brought the CT surgeons and the vascular surgeons also together with the interventional cardiologists. It's more of a working relationship, and both of us try to help each other out.
Oh, that's great. Well, listen, I know you have something to do. I appreciate the time you took out today, and as soon as this comes out, I'll let you know.
That's beautiful, Rich. I really appreciate it, and thanks for giving me an opportunity to talk about this. If there's any questions, feel free to call me anytime.
Thanks so much, Carmelo. Have a great night.
Take care.
Take care.